The night the power went out across the whole neighborhood. I was the only one who wasn't surprised, because I'd seen it coming for 3 months. I'd told them it was coming, and they'd looked me right in the eye, shaken my hand, and voted me out anyway. My name is Gerald Harmon. I'm 58 years old. I've lived in Maple Crest Commons, a quiet, planned community of about 240 homes outside of Columbus, Ohio, for going on 16 years now. Before I retired early from the utility sector, I spent 26 years working for a regional power company. Grid maintenance, emergency response, backup systems. I knew electricity the way some men know their own heartbeat, not because I thought about it, but because I felt it. When I moved into Maple Crest, I noticed something the rest of the neighborhood didn't think twice about. The community had an aging backup generator system, a commercial-grade Kohler unit that sat in a concrete housing behind the main clubhouse. It had been installed back in 2003 to support the community's shared infrastructure. The gated entrance, the streetlights along the main boulevard, the sump pumps in the lower quadrant homes, the security cameras, the clubhouse HVAC, and the emergency lighting in the 4 pedestrian underpasses that connected the back sections of the neighborhood. The system had been quietly maintained by a small local electrical service company, Bauer & Sons, for over a decade before I arrived. When I got to know the owner, Pete Bauer, I realized he'd been running a contract that included monthly testing, quarterly inspections, annual load bank testing, and 24-hour emergency response. His annual fee was $11,000, split across 240 homes. That was less than $4 a month per household. $4 a month. For years, nobody thought about it. The streetlights came on. The gate opened. After the big ice storm in 2019, when the grid went down for 6 hours, Maple Crest barely blinked. The generator kicked in within 8 seconds. People didn't even put down their coffee. That was the problem. When a system works perfectly, people forget it exists. And when people forget something exists, sooner or later, someone starts asking why they're paying for it. It started at the February HOA meeting. I remember the date, February 9th, because there was still snow on the ground and the parking lot was half empty. But somehow the energy inside that clubhouse room was anything but cold. Sandra Weiss, the newly elected HOA treasurer, stood up with a printed budget breakdown and a very confident expression. Sandra was sharp, organized, and had a real talent for finding line items that looked too large on paper. The generator contract was at the top of her list. $11,000 a year, she said, tapping the paper, for a generator that, as far as I can tell, has only been actually used twice in the past 5 years. That's $5,500 per use. That's not cost-effective, folks. There was a ripple of murmuring, heads nodding, a few people shifting in their seats the way you do when someone finally says what you've been half thinking but couldn't articulate. Dennis Park, who lived on the north side and ran a landscaping business, leaned forward. Can't we just, I don't know, rent one if we ever really need it? Emergency rental. Pete Bauer's son, who'd been sitting in the back of the room quietly, raised his hand. He explained what a rental situation would actually look like: lead times, delivery delays, the fact that during a regional outage, every rental unit in a 50-mile radius would already be spoken for. He was polite about it. Patient. He might as well have been speaking to an empty room. Then Sandra made her motion: cancel the Bauer & Sons contract at the end of the current quarter, bank the $11,000, and allocate it toward resurfacing the community tennis courts. I stood up. I kept my voice even because I've learned that when you sound alarmed, people stop listening to the words and start responding to the tone. I want to walk you through what that generator actually protects, I said. The sump pumps in the lower quadrant, homes on Birchwood and Millstone, those run on community electrical infrastructure. If we lose grid power for more than a couple of hours during a heavy rain event, those basements flood. Not a little. A lot. We're talking finished basements, HVAC systems, water heaters, significant property damage. Gerald, Sandra said, in that particular tone people use when they're being patient with someone they think is catastrophizing. We're in Columbus, Ohio. We're not in a flood zone. We're not in a flood zone, I agreed. But we are in a neighborhood where 43 homes sit in a natural drainage basin. The sump pumps aren't optional, and without tested, maintained backup power, they're also not reliable. The vote was 17-4. Contract canceled, effective April 30th. I drove home that night thinking about a word Pete Bauer's son had used when he left the meeting, quiet and a little defeated. He'd said, "They'll figure it out." I hoped he was wrong about the way they'd have to figure it out. For the first few weeks of May, nothing happened. The weather was mild. The grid held. Sandra sent a cheerful newsletter noting that the HOA had already redirected the first quarterly installment toward the tennis court project. Then the second week of May brought 3 straight days of hard rain. It started with small things. The entrance gate, which had a backup battery system rated for about 6 hours, started behaving erratically after the battery began its slow, unnoticed decline. Nobody had tested it since Pete pulled his equipment. One morning it opened fine. That afternoon it didn't close. Then it closed halfway. Then it stopped responding to remotes altogether. By day 2, the main boulevard streetlights, which the generator had always quietly supported during brownouts, started flickering at dusk. Not dramatically, just enough that a few residents texted the HOA Facebook page. Sandra posted that the utility company was aware of some grid fluctuations in the area, which was true. But the reason Maplecrest had never felt those fluctuations before was sitting in a concrete housing behind the clubhouse, cold and unused. On the morning of day 3, I got a knock on my door at 6:45 a.m. It was my neighbor, Carol Simmons. She was 63, lived alone on Birchwood Drive, and her voice had a tightness in it I recognized immediately. "Gerald, my basement. Something's wrong." Her sump pump had been running on community power infrastructure and a shared circuit that, without backup support during the overnight brownout, had cycled off for approximately 4 hours between 2 and 6 a.m. 4 hours was enough. Her window well had been partially clogged with debris, which hadn't mattered before because the pump had always stayed ahead of it. Now there was standing water, maybe 3 inches, across the entire floor of her finished basement. Her treadmill. Her daughter's stored furniture. Her late husband's woodworking tools still in their cases. She didn't cry in front of me. She's not that kind of woman. But her hands were shaking when she held her phone out to show me the photos she'd just taken. 2 doors down, the same thing had happened to the Acaffer family. Their basement was unfinished, which softened the blow slightly, but their water heater was down there, and it had been sitting in 3 inches of water. By noon that day, there were 4 flooded basements on Birchwood and 2 on Millstone. The HOA emergency line, a cell phone that rotated between board members, had received 11 calls before 10 a.m. The Facebook group was no longer cheerful. People were angry, but they were angry in the scattered, unfocused way people get when something goes wrong and they don't fully understand why yet. They blamed the utility company. They blamed the weather. Someone blamed the drainage contractor who'd done work on the main channel 2 years prior. I stayed quiet. I answered Carol's questions, helped her move what could be moved, and called a water mitigation company on her behalf. I did not post anything to the Facebook group. The real collapse came on the evening of May 19th. A line of severe thunderstorms swept through central Ohio. Nothing historic, nothing that made the national news, but a solid, sustained storm system that dropped about 2.5 inches of rain in 90 minutes and brought a brief but sharp voltage event that knocked out grid power to roughly 4,000 customers in our part of Columbus. The outage hit at 7:42 p.m. Maplecrest went dark. Not the soft, partial dark of flickering streetlights. Completely dark. The boulevard lamps, off the gate, frozen open, its battery long since dead. The security cameras, black. The 4 pedestrian underpasses connecting the back sections of the neighborhood, pitch black. In a neighborhood where a significant number of residents were over 55, where people walked dogs after dinner, where the Hendersons' 14-year-old daughter cut through the underpass on her way back from her friend's house 3 streets over complete darkness in those passages wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a safety issue. 2 elderly residents on the far side of the community, Margaret Chen, 71, and Robert Kessler, 74, were effectively cut off from the clubhouse, which served as the community's designated emergency meeting point. The underpasses were the only reasonable route. Without lighting and in the rain, neither of them attempted it. Margaret tripped on her back patio in the darkness, reaching for a flashlight she kept on a shelf inside the door. She bruised her hip badly enough that her daughter drove from Westerville the following morning to take her to urgent care. She wasn't seriously injured, but she could have been. Robert Kessler had a medical alert device that required Wi-Fi connectivity. The community's shared network, another infrastructure node supported by the generator system, was down. His device was offline for 4 hours. His son found out 2 days later and called the HOA board directly. He was not calm about it. The grid was restored at 11:58 p.m., 4 hours and 16 minutes after the outage began. In the old days, in the days of the Bauer contract, the generator would have kicked in within 8 seconds. The lights would have stayed on. The cameras would have kept recording. The underpasses would have been lit. The sump pumps would have run. 4 hours and 16 minutes of darkness because the community had saved $46 per household per year. That was the math when you finally did it honestly. The emergency HOA meeting 3 days later was standing room only. I sat in the third row and said nothing for the first 40 minutes. I listened to the utility company representative explain, carefully and diplomatically, that the grid event had been within normal parameters and that Maple Crest's infrastructure management was a community responsibility, not a utility responsibility. I listened to Dennis Park describe cleaning out his basement with a shop vac at midnight. I listened to the Aquaforce attorney, present via speakerphone, outline the basis for a potential claim against the HOA for the loss of their water heater and approximately $1,800 in stored property. And then Sandra Weiss, to her credit, because this took something, raised her hand and asked for the floor. She stood up straight. She looked around the room. I want to acknowledge that the decision to cancel the Bauer contract was mine. I brought the motion, I presented the cost-benefit analysis, and I got it wrong. You could have heard a pin drop. I got it wrong because I calculated the cost of the service, but I didn't calculate the cost of losing it. And those are two completely different numbers. She turned and looked directly at me. Gerald, I owe you an apology. You told us exactly what would happen. You were specific, you were calm, and we didn't listen. I let a moment pass. I didn't want to say the wrong thing. I didn't want to be the person who says I told you so when someone is standing in front of a room showing real humility. Sandra, I said, I appreciate that. I really do. The goal now is just getting the system back in order. Will Bauer and Sons still work with us? Someone called out from the back. I'd already made a quiet call to Pete's son earlier that week. I knew the answer. They will, I said, but the generator needs a full inspection and load test before we can certify it for use again. It's been sitting for 6 weeks. We also need to replace the gate battery and service the battery backups on the boulevard lights. The total catch-up cost will be higher than if we'd never canceled. That part landed hard. The silence in the room had a different texture now. How much higher? Sandra asked. Roughly $3,200 in deferred maintenance and inspection costs on top of reinstating the annual contract. More silence. So we saved $11,000, Dennis said slowly, and it's going to cost us $14,000 to get back to where we were. Plus whatever the HOA's liability exposure is on the flooded basements, I said quietly. I'll let your attorney speak to that. The vote to reinstate the Bauer contract was unanimous, 21-0. Pete's son had his crew out within the week. They ran a full diagnostic on the generator, replaced 2 aging transfer switch components they'd actually flagged in a report the previous year. A report that had been filed and never followed up on, replaced the gate battery, serviced the boulevard light backups, and ran a full load test on a Saturday morning in early June. The generator kicked in within 7 seconds. Some of the neighbors had come out to watch. Not many, a handful. Carol Simmons was one of them. She stood on the sidewalk with her coffee and watched the lights along the boulevard hold steady while Pete's crew ran the test from the utility panel. She looked over at me. We were fools, she said simply. We were human, I said. It's the same thing sometimes. The tennis courts didn't get resurfaced that year. The money went back into the Infrastructure Reserve Fund, along with an additional assessment that covered the mitigation and repair costs. Nobody was happy about it, but nobody argued either. The HOA also passed a new policy requiring that any proposal to cancel or modify a maintenance contract affecting community infrastructure had to include a written failure impact assessment, not just a cost analysis, but a specific accounting of what systems depended on that service and what the consequences of losing it would be. It was a small policy. Quiet. The kind of rule that doesn't make headlines or get celebrated. But it mattered. Because systems like that, the ones that quietly hold everything together, don't fail loudly. They fail in the dark in the middle of a rainstorm when an elderly woman is reaching for a flashlight she shouldn't have needed. Here's what 16 years in the utility sector and one very long spring in Maple Crest Commons taught me about the systems that keep life running. You don't notice them when they're working. That's the point. That's how they're supposed to be. A system that does its job well is invisible, and invisibility in a budget meeting looks a lot like waste. It isn't. The things we pay for without thinking, the backup, the maintenance contract, the quiet professional who shows up once a month and runs a test nobody watches, those aren't line items to cut when times get lean. Those are the insurance policies that pay out in the moments that actually matter. We had 240 homes in Maple Crest. We had elderly residents, families, people with medical devices, people with finished basements and stored memories and lives that depended quietly, invisibly on 8 seconds of backup power. $4 a month. That's what we were paying for that 8 seconds. When you're sitting in a budget meeting, looking at a line item that seems too high for something that's never visibly broken, before you make that motion, ask yourself one question. What is this actually protecting? Not what does it cost? Not when did we last notice it? But what specifically goes wrong if it disappears? Because I promise you something goes wrong. It always does. Systems exist for a reason, and the reason usually only becomes visible in the dark. If this story made you think about something in your own neighborhood, your own HOA, your own community, I'd ask you to do one thing. Take 10 minutes this week and look at the services quietly running in the background of your life. The ones you haven't thought about in months. The ones that just work. Then ask whether you know why. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing because every week we tell stories like this one. Real. Grounded. The kind that make you think twice about the quiet systems holding your world together. And stay prepared. Because in this life, the things that matter most are almost always the things you don't notice, right up until you do.